Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, June 12th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week. You'll realize that I don't have any host-read ads this week. Ads have been very, very slow this podcast year, and I'm seeing this across the podcast that I work on, and even when I talk to my friends and colleagues who are podcasters. And so really a huge part of the way that we can financially keep this train on the tracks is through our Patreon accounts. And so Patreon, of course, is a service where you can pledge for me, it's a per episode basis. For a lot of people, it's monthly. I'm open to ideas if you think that should change, but right now I've kept it as per episode because sometimes I don't air an episode and I wouldn't want you to be penalized for that. And so what you do is you visit patreon.com/talknerdy. You look through all the different tiers and the levels of support and what they offer. And for as little as like $1 an episode, it can be a huge, huge help. Think of it, I mean, it's in the name, right? Patron, you're a patron of the arts. Patreon, yes, patreon.com/talknerdy. So this week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so, so much. All right, so let's talk about this week's episode. So I had the opportunity to sit down with Cal Flyn. She's an author, an investigative journalist, and a McDowell Fellow from the Highlands of Scotland. She's worked as a reporter for the Sunday Times and the Telegraph and has contributed to publications including Granta, The Guardian, The Times, The Observer, and so many more. Her first book was called Thicker Than Water. It was one of the Times' best books of 2016. And she has a new book out called Islands of Abandonment, Nature Rebounding in the Post-Human Landscape. So without any further ado, here she is, Cal Flyn. Well, Cal, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I'm excited to talk about your new book, but before I dive into the actual content, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you. Your name is Cal. Is that short for Caledonia, or is that a terrible guess?
No, that would be lovely. I would also like if it was short for, say, Calliope or Calpurnia, but unfortunately it's shorter for the more quotidian Caroline.
Oh, Caroline. Oh, love it. Love it. And so you're from the Highlands. You don't sound like you're from the Highlands.
No, I have a sort of floating accent. I'm not really entirely sure why, because I am really from the Highlands and I've got two Scottish parents and I currently live in the Highlands and Islands. So here we are.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm happy to say that myself and the majority of my American listeners shouldn't have any problems deciphering. Unless you actually do start speaking Scottish and like using words that we don't know, but beyond that, okay.
I'll try.
No, please do. It's quite fun. Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself. So you are a writer, obviously. Have you always been a writer? Did you study journalism in school, or did you come to this through a different path?
A slightly different path. I studied experimental psychology at university. So I think the reason that I wanted to do that was it sort of in between arts and science. Certainly the way that I studied it, there was a lot of both. And I think that's a thread that's run a lot through my career. While I was at university, I got really into student journalism. Like me and all my friends spent countless overnights in this sort of fluorescent lit box of an office making a newspaper together. And then a lot of us went into the media in London. So I worked for a magazine called The Week, and then a couple of newspapers called The Sunday Times and The Daily Telegraph in London for a while, before I decided that actually, rather than being a reporter, which is what I was doing then, as sort of news and investigations, what I really wanted to do was write sort of more longer form work and spend longer times on sort of individual projects. And ultimately that turned into a first book.
Love it. And so this is your second book that we're actually talking. I mean, obviously we can talk about your first book too, or is it? Am I backward? Is Islands of Abandonment your
second book? That's right.
Okay. I was looking at how they're listed on your website and I was like, oh, am I getting confused? Tell me about your first book first then, Thicker Than Water.
Sure. So that book is a story I found sort of digging into my family tree a little bit. I found out that there was someone I was distantly related to who had been sort of lauded as an explorer of colonial Australia and had a lot of things named after him over there, had been a local hero, essentially. And then more recently, he's been, questioned. His role has been questioned, and he's now thought to have led a number of very significant massacres of the local Aboriginal people, the Gunai Kurnai, who are in a part of Victoria, nearish to Melbourne. So I guess that first book was sort of digging into this, this darker side of colonial history, and looking also at, what does that mean for the present day generation, both of the Gunai Kurnai and for descendants of the sort of colonial pioneers.
Yeah, I can imagine that doing the research for that book must have been quite, I don't know, complicated emotionally for you.
Yeah, it was. It was not something that I knew a great deal about going into, so it was really a journey of discovery, and also these conversations were really difficult ones to have in the present day. We had a combination of having personal discussion with contemporary Gunai Kurnai people and meeting elders, and also to try and have a bit of a reckoning as well. And so we were friendly, and yet we were dealing with this sort of heavy historical past together. And it was an interesting and sort of, well, the Australians have this amazing word, confronting. It was a really confronting experience. So I've started using that word myself.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's interesting too that sort of when we look at the work that you do, your journalism, but also your long form, you do. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. You do tend to write more kind of like nature ecology writing, or do you see yourself spread amongst a lot of different topics?
That's become what I write now. So it's really been kind of an evolving thing. So when I wrote my first book, that was, as I said, my first really big project. And over time, well, I moved back to my native Scotland. I spent a lot of time in the countryside. I'm a very outdoorsy person. And so I ultimately ended up writing a number of sort of long read type articles, which are often about environmental ethics or sometimes environmental aesthetics, things like that. And I think that is where my second book, Islands of Abandonment, grew out of. And I felt like I sort of hit my stride somewhere between the two books. This is kind of my subject, or I don't know. It can be a funny thing, sort of finding your niche as a writer. And I think that these questions of sort of how we relate to the land, how we relate to nature, and how we picture it, those seem to be the topics I'm coming back to again and again. And in a sense, I think the book about colonial history also drew on that. I was talking about people who had been uprooted in terms of the pioneers, and then people who were being forced from their land as well. So I think that all of these questions I keep coming back to again and again.
Yeah, I find myself even looking at my show. We're kind of coming up. I think we're in the seventh, maybe even the eighth year of the show now. So coming up on, I don't know, 450 some odd episodes. And let me see. I think you're going to be 458. At the very beginning of Talk Nerdy, it was very hard science because I was doing hard science at the time, and I was working as a pretty kind of classical science journalist and science communicator. And then as I continued my career in psychology and kind of did more work in, I don't know, activism spaces, there's a huge shift. You can see I still do hard science on the show, but there's this social justice, humanistic component that I've been bringing in more and more. And it sounds to me like, even going back to your work in university all the way through your journalism, you've sort of found that balance as well between the scientific and the artistic, the human and the natural.
Yeah, and this is a discussion I have more and more with people about this idea of sort of working in an interdisciplinary space, how do you combine these two things? Because I feel really strongly that a lot of people who are working in hard science also have these emotional responses to place, and they really feel the wonder or the awe in the science or the maths or whatever they're working in. They really feel that and think deeply about it. And often when you read scientific papers. There's not necessarily space to sort of go into that kind of thing, but I do think that everyone has both of these sides in them.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that, I don't know, I guess like the joy of narrative nonfiction and kind of the form that I work in means that you can do both, and you can sort of dip into stats and facts, and then you can pull entirely into the first person and talk about how it feels to be in a space, how it, like, does the hair stand up on the back of your neck? What does it mean to talk to this person? What impact does it have on you? And so I really enjoy doing that, and I'm sort of like leaning more and more into that, like, I don't know how to talk about it, like the more like subjective elements of that.
And the truth of the matter is, I think that they are really two sides of the same coin. I often struggle with my colleagues who are just very kind of logical positivist in their thinking, and really try to make a distinction always between, I don't know, logic and emotion, or thoughts and feelings. And it's like, it's all in your brain, my friend. Like, these are all things that are happening all the time. I
Right,
actually
right.
just
We contain multitudes. Absolutely.
Yeah. I actually just quoted an Indian philosopher. I shared a meme on my Instagram page yesterday, and I had to pull it up as you were talking about that. And his quote was, "A mind all logic is like a knife all blade. It makes the hand bleed that uses it."
Ooh, I like
So,
that.
I mean, right? Like, it's so beautiful, this idea that we cannot do science and we cannot engage with scientific thought if not for the human beings that are involved and their relationship with nature. And so I'm so excited to like dive into the things that you discovered, the reason that you dove into islands of abandonment. So maybe let's start there. What was it about these kind of abandoned places that made you interested in starting to do the reporting that you did for the book?
Right. I think probably the book sort of started in a feeling, right? Which was like sometimes you know that something's important and you have to like figure out what it is. And so I wrote an early essay about going to a region off the west coast of Scotland, the Slate Islands, and these were old quarries. They didn't turn up on the book, but I think this is the thinking that sort of set me down this road. And there are these old slate quarries. They were a center of industry in the 19th century. And at some point, these quarries, which were on these tiny islands, so there's like really deep quarries on these tiny, tiny islands. So some of them look like donuts, others are just like really deeply pitted. There was a huge storm and they got flooded. And now, essentially, it became impossible to keep quarrying there. And so there are these deep, very still pools on these tiny islands. And so I went to go there, and there's sort of like not exactly a tourist hotspot, but people will visit there. They've become a sort of area of beautiful natural scenery. I went there and went wild swimming with my partner, and we saw these little birds. And the slate, there's like shoots of broken bits of slate, like the offcuts from that industry, and it's all grown over with strange weeds. And I don't know, it was kind of like an amazing place. In some senses it was really ugly, and in others it was just really pretty and beautiful. And so it made me think a lot about like the work of Edward Bertinsky, the photographer. He's Canadian, and he has these enormous large format photographs of like, I don't know, like salt pans or like motorways, or just like these really deeply human impacted habitats. And on one hand, they're incredibly beautiful images, and he blows them up huge, and you just like really warm to the colors or the shapes, the textures. And on the other hand, they show that like scenes of natural devastation, and your brain doesn't really know what to do with it. It's this incredible conflict. And so I guess I wrote a little bit about that, the idea of like the ugly, beautiful landscape, what that meant, like the beauty of the post-industrial, and could you enjoy that while also understanding that it had been incredibly damaging. And so I guess the sites that ended up being in an islands of abandonment were really similar. Often they were worst case scenarios. So there would be somewhere. So I wrote about the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So somewhere where there'd been a nuclear meltdown. There was the island of Montserrat where there had been enormous volcanic eruptions. Places that had been abandoned for economic decay or all sorts of reasons, really. And yet there was something about each of these places that sort of filled you with hope, or they were sort of strangely beautiful, either conceptually or physically, or they become ecologically virile, really unexpectedly. And I think that clash of emotions was what I was looking at. And so I understood that it was important, but I still had to do a lot of the work to actually figure out what exactly was going on and what was the science, or, what were the issues at hand.
Right. I feel like there's this simplification that human beings tend to do. We tend to categorize, we tend to like clean distinctions and boxes, and ambivalence is quite uncomfortable. Uncertainty is quite uncomfortable for human beings very often.
Mm.
But I can imagine that the emotional experiences that come up when spending time in these places, on the one hand, they're like creepy. Like we see, right, this is the backdrop of like video games and horror movies, and
Yeah,
there's a sort of isolation that brings fear, but also probably like a deep loneliness and sadness.
right.
But then superimposed on that is this aesthetic, this strange aesthetic of like, look how beautiful things can be when people aren't fucking them up. Or, truth be told, they are fucked up because of people, but now, like you mentioned, they're rebounding.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. And there's something comforting in it. I think, like the reason that we enjoy those post-apocalyptic movies is that final scene when, you see it either jumps forward and you see that they discover the people who've survived, or you see the plants reclaiming the space, or whatever it is. There's a sort of hopefulness that comes from looking at the worst case scenario and then saying, and then what next? Like, how does the recovery begin? And so it's not about it's not about closing our eyes to environmental degradation. It's more about looking at these sites. Well, I talked about them as being like forbidden experiments. So it would be immoral to bring about these circumstances, but they have happened. So
Yeah.
what can we learn from them? And I think that can be a source of like really interesting information. They're like controls. If for people who are working in, say, ecological rehabilitation, to look at sites that haven't been rehabbed in any way, and then see what's possible without us even getting involved. And that's very important information for us to know.
So, I mean, obviously, this is quite a big question, but I can imagine that the most simplified answer of, kind of the outcomes of these unintentional experiments is the Jurassic Park of it all, right? The life finds a way that, like, no matter what, you're going to see something thriving. But I can imagine that there's a bit more to it than that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I always the recovery in these places is very complicated. So, like, take Chernobyl as an example. You've got this like incredible rebounding of nature, and here I'm just saying sort of nature as a big concept. You see, 70% of the zone is now forest, quite dense forest. You've seen like a sevenfold increase of wolves. You've seen a return of bears for the first time in more than a century. But saying that, it is complicated, because it's not to say that the radiation has not damaged the creatures that are living inside the zone and in the highly contaminated areas. It's just that perhaps it's not damaging them enough to stop them breeding, or it might be that different species are coming to the fore. So, for example, the pine trees that were growing and were famously killed off in the red forest right next to the reactor. They've largely been replaced with silver birch, because silver birch is much better at dealing with radiation. And so we see a sort of changing of the guard according to what species are able to cope. And so it's not a straightforward recovery. We see a shifting of species. And, the ecosystems are very dynamic, and you do see this generally. So, of course, if there's been like a major change, what comes flooding back in is likely to look different. And here, in terms of the population numbers, it's great, but there's a lot of scientific controversy over exactly how affected and impacted the various species living inside the zone really are.
On the other show that I work on the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, a few weeks ago, we do different science stories each week. And a few weeks ago, I specifically focused on a recent study modeling sort of what are the greatest drivers of evolution via natural selection right now. And, by and large, it seems to be obviously human behavior. Like, human behavior is touching basically every species on the planet. And we're seeing that organisms that live within densely populated areas are more similar than organisms that live out in more rural areas, even if they are nearer to one another. So there's this idea that there's this kind of, I think there's a word for it, but I can't, like a parallel convergent evolution going on. Anyway, long story short, what's fascinating to me is this concept, right? We talk about natural selection, Darwin's kind of, classical definition of organisms breeding and having, increased fitness due to their ability to react to environmental pressures. And then those end up having more and more genes that spread out throughout the population. And then we talk about artificial selection, breeding, right? The way we choose dogs and domestic plants and different things like that. We force them together so that we can get an outcome we want. But I feel like we're not talking much about this in between, this middle, where it's like, yes, it's natural selection, but human beings inadvertently change the selection pressures. And that's what you're seeing in Chernobyl, right? You're seeing organisms that are now filling that niche, but that niche wouldn't have been invented or created without the nuclear meltdown.
Right. So, I mean, we see things constantly fitting themselves here or there, or arriving and thriving in a situation that would never have existed before. Or sometimes we have species which did exist, but perhaps in tiny numbers. So, for example, metal-tolerant plants, which do exist in nature, but we see them growing much more commonly now in anthropogenic sites. So places perhaps like metal mines, or places where there have been smelting plants, places where the ground has been tainted by heavy metals. You now find these really interesting species which either are able to close themselves off to heavy metals, or they love heavy metals, metallophytes, and they suck them up and store them in their body for some reasons that we don't entirely understand. But that's really interesting because we're getting these ecosystems that are really quite rare on a global scale, but they're becoming more common because we are creating these kind of toxic environments.
Right. And I think it's such a difficult thing when we look at phenomena, like emergent phenomena that exist in these massive systems where there's so many different variables, to make value judgments, I suppose,
Right.
to talk
Yeah.
about a moralistic view. But I mean, this can't be a good thing, right? I know I'm simplifying it, but that can't be a good thing, can it?
Yeah, I don't know. Like it's difficult because like we just automatically make moral judgments, right? And
Right. Yeah.
the process of the book has been, I've just been trying to like strip that from myself, or try to just, I don't know exactly, to be like, we've got this disgust with the species that are able to cope with proximity to humans. So like we really don't like foxes and rats and pigeons and all of this kind of thing. And, like in some way we see them as being tainted and being like less valuable. And partly that's because there are a lot of them. So of course, I can see that you maybe pity other species more. But also we have this sort of, I don't know if it's a sort of misanthropic feeling, and animals that are our familiars, we don't like, and we don't like this idea of the contaminated environment, the unclean environment. And so anything that's sort of seen as contaminated in some way by humans also is seen as somehow immoral as well. And I'm not saying that that's not true. I'm just saying it was interesting to me to realize how much of that sort of moral or ethical way of thinking was like really baked into my relationship with the natural world. And I've just been trying to sit down and interrogate that for a while.
Yeah, and there's this like irony to it, right? That somehow we are the biggest pest, yet we see all of the pests that can thrive within our presence as the pests.
Right.
So like you mentioned the rats and the pigeons and the cockroaches, and you say foxes, which is funny because here in the US, we're like, oh, foxes.
Oh, really?
I think your foxes are like our coyotes, I think. But yeah, like just these organisms that are a little bit too comfortable being around people, that eat our garbage, that spread disease, that have, there's just been so many chances for zoonotic spillover of infection.
Right.
We're
That's
living
probably the evolutionary reason that we feel like this, right? Which is that we don't
right.
want these other species coming in and sort of spreading stuff around. But yeah, it is culturally specific, which is really surprising to me.
Yeah, but it's also funny that like we're the worst of it, yet somehow we separate ourselves because we're the observer. We separate ourselves from that and think like, oh, I want pristine nature. Like I deserve to live in pristine nature or to visit at least. Yet we're the ones who are actively terraforming this planet, right? We're the ones who are actively building roads and bridges and laying concrete everywhere and removing habitat and really just dramatically changing the landscape.
Right. And also like our attempts to repair things is coming from a good place. Like I think that's really good feeling that we want to restore habitats. But sometimes I guess like the when we go in with very interventionist methods, we can disturb these sort of self-willed environments that are regrowing under their own steam, and sort of plant the species that we want to be there, plant the species that we admire or find attractive or something, and we can create these gardens essentially that need a lot of work from us to keep them going because we don't like the weeds that have come in, or we don't like these species that have been able to thrive. And so that I find that quite interesting, how often our restoration projects can really like fall into this idea of gardening.
Yeah, that's such a smart way to frame it. Like it's both reality and metaphor that we're literally building gardens places. This classic kind of like colonialist view of like, these are the beautiful things from the old land, that I want to put here now because I'm familiar with them and they're comfortable to me, which is so just destructive. And also, like you said, it requires so much more effort, more water, more pesticides, more all of the different things we need to keep these things alive. And yet it's not just the plants, is it? We're literally building like zoo gardens also because we're choosing which flora and fauna we want to protect, let's say because they're pretty or charismatic or they make us feel certain things, and which ones we ignore.
Yeah.
Like people don't seem to be so sad about the massive like amphibian decline, like the background, it's like, I can't remember, like 100 times the background rate of extinction. But those pandas, we got to save the pandas.
Yeah, and it's the way our emotions work when we think about the environment, and that has a huge impact. Like I can see if you're running an environmental NGO, it is important to appeal to people emotionally and to use the pandas. Absolutely, they've got money to raise, and people respond to that. But yeah, I don't know. There was an example that I talk about in Islands of Abandonment, which was we have these. They're called bings. They're these sort of gravel heaps that we have quite near to Edinburgh, our capital city in Scotland, and these were produced also actually during the mining industry in the 19th century, the oil shale mining. They were these like sterile piles of shale, just like crumbled up into tiny bits of gravel. They've been there for decades now. The last mine closed in 1960, and they've been regrowing through that basic process of succession. When you see the first sort of like annual weeds will come in, like flowers and mosses and lichens, and they hold everything steady. And then you get more like shrubs and then trees, really hardy ones like the birch, come in and start holding things down. They're very kind of like sand dunes in a way. So we have those here, and there was a really interesting study that looked at some of the things that were restored. So people came in the 70s and 80s and started trying to make them look more natural. So they're like smoothing them over. They were like greening them. They were adding nutrients, fertilizers. They would plant the things that they wanted to be there and make them a bit more like parks. And really what's happened is that has backfired because they uprooted a lot of the stuff that had been doing well there, but was maybe unusual or you didn't expect to see them there. It's a really random ecosystem that's popped up on the ones that haven't been sort of interfered with. But those have become quite biodiverse, interesting and self-sufficient, and going in and trying to fix the ones that were restored has sort of set back their recovery because those plants that went in, they needed the fertilizers to keep coming. They needed to be watered. They needed people to go back and check on them and maintain them. And so actually in the long run, the ones that were just left to their own devices have become a lot more ecologically interesting. And there's some hyper local species of birds that has popped up, and really unusual flowers that are there that you don't really find anywhere else. And that's just interesting. Restoration ecology has moved on a lot since then. So these are probably one of the case studies that people have learned from, but it is an interesting sort of, I don't know, a corrective to make us think, okay, do we know best, or are the species that we're sort of relying on, maybe we allow them to do what they can do?
Right. It's almost this kind of like tendency, I think, that human beings have to say, we did a thing and then this was the outcome. And the outcome was detrimental. So now, how do we undo the thing? How do we fix it and try and make it go back to how it was, as opposed to that thing is done? Sadly, we have to live with the consequences of the thing we did and figure out how to make the future work for this area and for these organisms. I think we have this very romantic approach where we want to, I don't know, undo our damage, which maybe is not the most realistic.
Well, it comes from a great place, and I really don't want to stamp down on that, because also we should not damage things, and if we can undo things, we should undo things, but we can't always undo things, and we do have this sort of instinct to roll up our sleeves and get handy, like we want to open the bonnet and fix stuff, and actually often interfering with stuff can cause a fresh problem, and it's just like constantly being started afresh and having to regrow. And I don't know, it's just something that we must always bear in mind, like the sort of balance of whether or not we should be getting involved in these sites. And actually often these brownfield sites or these derelict sites are incredibly biodiverse. Here in the UK, and I don't know if you have an equivalent, but we now recognise that many brownfield sites can be open mosaic habitats, and these are now a priority habitat that they're trying to keep. And that's because in these open mosaic habitats, what you often have is like lots of tiny little habitats next to each other. You might have standing stagnant pools, you might have broken down old bits of wall, maybe some old tarmac, some shrubs. And that's really great for invertebrate life because it needs all of these different things at different stages of its life cycle. And so actually you can find some very, very rare creatures hiding in old mines or in old derelict sites that have been left for decades at a time, that initially your instinct is like, oh my God, we should get rid of this. We should knock that down and start afresh. Maybe we should plant some trees, and actually what's there is already incredibly valuable if you know what you're looking for, if you're surveying it, if you're looking for invertebrate life. And often we're not. So it's just like a question of values. And so often we assume that our instinctive value judgments are correct. And we really need to question them and really dig down into them.
Yeah. And I wonder, if you think about different variables like time, for example, these places that you visited, these places that you write about have been there a while. And there's, as we use terms to describe them, decay, dilapidation, whatever. These are areas where people are not because something happened. Either all of the resources were extracted, so it was left behind, or there was a tragedy, or whatever. But they've been there a long time, and I can't help but keep going back to this cliche in my mind that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That we tend so much to think about how to fix things after the fact, as opposed to how do we learn from those situations, knowing that they are what they are, and there has been enough time for there to be some sort of, like you mentioned, natural experiment, some sort of rebounding. But how do we now, the next time we build, the next time we engage, make the footprint of these things a bit lighter, make them more capable of being recycled, extracted, whatever. I think that's the part. I don't know. I keep paralleling this to satellites in space, and how when we first started putting satellites up, we just shot them up there and we're like, whatever. And then we were like, oh crap, there's a lot of trash up there. And every time they break into each other, they make more trash. And eventually we realized this is not sustainable. So now when you put up a satellite, it has to have a plan. It
Mm-hmm.
has to
Mm-hmm.
deorbit. You have to know how you're going to get it down, because otherwise you're just contributing to the mess. And I feel like this is such the human story, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've seen that so many times with so many different things. I mean, we've seen that with CFCs. We've seen that with, like, I talk about all the pollutants that we pumped into, like, Newark Bay. That was just, okay, so that was just one example of a complete global phenomenon, which is just, we just thought if we put stuff in the rivers and it carried it to the sea, then jobs are good on, like everything's
Right.
fine, there's loads of water. And then it turns out if you keep doing that with, like, really poisonous gunk, it builds up surprisingly quickly. Like, in the space of a few years or decades, you're swimming around in toxic sludge, you're killing off all the, and we can't seem to learn from one and then, I don't know, guess that
Yeah.
that's going to be exactly the same thing with exactly, I don't know, just like new technology. So that we go into stuff and we just think that it's probably going to be fine until we go way too far.
Yeah, this idea that, like, we'll figure it out later. We'll develop some sort of big, I don't know, vacuum cleaner that'll take care of it all. We'll make a new
Right.
net or something that'll clean it all up. And it's like, no, it needs to be built into the technology from the beginning. And it's so fascinating to me when you see, like, in developing regions where new technology is going in for the first time, and there's no longer the need to lay certain types of wires or to utilize certain types of old, quite detrimental technology to the landscape, because we can simply use the satellite technology, or we have these new, like, kind of a lighter footprint in how energy is brought to a town, or how, like, water is cleaned. And if we go in that way, just the obviously there's always going to be unintended stuff, but we got to
Right.
think about it in advance.
Yeah. 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 And, I guess, this is a result of this idea of, move fast and break things. Like the technological advancement often happens so much faster than we really understand the consequences of it. And I understand that. And it's really difficult to understand the big picture while you're a small part within it. Right. But I don't know, can we as a species get better at it? That would be the dream.
Right. And so I'm curious, like, what kinds of things that you've studied so many interesting places. You mentioned Chernobyl, of course, and that's one I think that a lot of people think about as this fascinating ecological experiment. But you also talk a bit about the demarcation zone, the DMZ in Korea. And I'm really curious about this area where there's just, like, not a lot going on. I mean, there have been things that happen there, but it's like a fascinating ecological phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. And the DMZ is a really interesting one because it's still, very much almost like a black box. Like, they do occasional surveys, and they suggest that there might be Amur tigers in there. There's, like, one guy who thinks there might be Siberian tigers. There's certainly a lot of, like, redback cranes, all sorts of species that are doing well in there. And they're very undisturbed. I suppose, like, you see these as being sort of uh, um, like almost like weird safe havens in the most unsafe place in the world. And so I had a look at the what they call the Green Line across the island of Cyprus, which is another no man's land, and that's been standing since the end of the 70s. It's sort of watched over by the UN, and it's got watchtowers on either side by North Cyprus and the Republic of Cyprus. And they've been in this weird stalemate. And so these stalemate situations are what allows these no man's land buffer zone type ecosystems to recover. Is not that war is good for the environment, God no. It's these strange stalemates that pop up, and they can last for decades at a time. And we saw this. We talk about the European Green Line. Now this is the former boundary of east versus west in Europe. It started out as the zone between East and West Germany. They had what they called the kill zone, which was really like a fenced off region that was spotlit. But it also had, on the East German side, it had an area of forest often, or farmland that was very restricted. And so bird lovers, bird spotters from both sides of the border would go and watch these birds and keep count of them. And so they knew it was an incredibly rich area for bird life, because although obviously the kill zone wasn't a great place for them, it being quite, like, stripped of vegetation, this, like, protected control area on the east side was very good for birds. And so when unification happened, there was this like amazing meeting between bird lovers on both sides. They went to meet in a tavern, and then they figured out how they were going to try and maintain this strange nature reserve that had popped up along this site of recrimination and danger. And so that model did really well, and they've now extended it up so that there are lots of different nature reserves through all of the countries along that old border from the Cold War. And they call this the European Green Line. And there's a sort of route that you can go. You can cycle down it, and it starts off in Finland, and it goes all the way down to the Balkans, and it goes through some of the wildest areas in Europe, and you can see an incredible range of habitats and climate zones by traveling down this area. And you see this with some other, they call them peace parks in other situations, which is like when you have this border dispute between two countries. Often it goes on for a long time. It becomes very difficult to do any development in those areas, and you get a strange benefit from this, which is the recovery or the lack of damage being done to the natural environment in that region. And so sometimes the peace park can be negotiated as part of a sort of package between the two countries that helps them maintain a status quo and come to some kind of wider agreement.
I mean, it's fascinating, it's ironic, and it's just so deeply disturbing. It doesn't surprise me at all, but how much does this reinforce just this idea that everywhere that people are, they destroy?
Well, I don't know. I think we have to be pretty careful about that, because I don't think that's necessarily true. In fact, I'm sort of working on ideas around this at the moment, and I think that is a sort of instinct that pops up in us. It's another thing we have to question, because often, actually, when you look at regions that have been abandoned, particularly areas that have been traditional farmland, for example, you might even see a drop in biodiversity, because traditional farmland can, if it's been existing in that form for centuries, often it has almost like familiar species that live along that. So in Estonia, we had an interesting discussion. That's a really interesting case. So after the USSR collapsed, a lot of the land in former Soviet states they attempted to redistribute it to the families that originally owned it after it had been requisitioned for collective farming. That didn't always happen, or the families didn't want to come back. And so a lot of farmland has fallen into disuse, and it's an incredible carbon sink. A lot of the land in Estonia and all of those countries down there are, they're returning to forest, huge jumps in forestry. So that's fantastic from a carbon sequestration point of view. But some ecologists locally are actually kind of anxious because they're losing the species that were associated with farming there. And so I think it's not necessarily the problem is people. It's more the sort of like large scale destruction, especially like industrial scale stuff.
But isn't that kind of the point? Like, even I feel like even that example reinforces it. Like, while it was farmed, you had this drop in biodiversity, and now that it's kind of rewilding, you're seeing the ecology
No,
booming
not
again.
always the case. It can be the other way around as well. So
Okay.
So if you are farming using traditional methods, it might actually be full of birds and insects and things that thrive on the edge of forests, or like where forests meet meadow, or if you're using like wood pasture systems, that can be very biodiverse because you get sun loving and shade loving species, so that can all come together to be more diverse than, say, a dense forest, which is a very specific kind of thing. So again, one thing can be true and the other one can be, like, you can be happy about the trees growing because we really need trees on the planet, and it is quite unusual to have undisturbed wild forest. We don't, certainly in Europe, we don't have a lot of like ancient forests. So if you have forests that, okay, admittedly they've only been regrowing since the 1990s, but there are a few decades into the process of becoming ancient forests, if you see what I mean. They've got a lot of potential. But if you love sun-loving species, perhaps you'd be sad about this transition. So I think we can understand that there's lots of different ways to value land, and that they can be good and bad all at once.
This obviously does go back to this idea of like value judgments hold value for the observer, and they're going to be different for different uh, parties, and what they're hoping to get, what the agenda is. But I don't know, I still struggle with this idea that yes, obviously there are examples in which practice it, like especially when we look at indigenous practices where there is a great reverence for the land, and where there's been a long tradition of living harmoniously with nature. And then, of course, more modern scientific practices where individuals have developed an understanding, or are now making decisions with that mindset. Like you mentioned, like more modern ecological approaches are much more mindful. But you take those caveats away, and maybe I shouldn't have said just where people are, nature is destroyed, but like, I don't know, where Western people are, where like large percentages of people are, like where modern technology is, it just doesn't seem like we've been all that nice to our planet for like a really long time now.
Yeah, and I think that idea of like what can we take from these more sustainable ways of living, like in terms of mindset, like how can we not drain and drain and drain, but instead think, this word sustainable is really easy to say and more difficult to put into practice, but that's got to be our plan, right? Which is that we don't take too much and we don't spoil too much, and somehow we can not create these pileups of chemicals or pollutions or space rubbish or whatever it is. It's trying to, as you say, bake that in from the start with whatever new technology we have.
Right. But of course, the big, well, I shouldn't say the big takeaway, but what are some of the thematic takeaways specifically of the work that you did in visiting and really painting a beautiful picture for us of these eerie and dark yet beautiful spaces where, you know, what's done was done, and whatever the value judgment is on what was done, we could grapple or quibble about, but now there is this change, this I don't know, what would you call it, this growth that you see in these places.
Yeah, I suppose in some level there's an acceptance of, even appreciation of, these human impacted environments, the understanding that they can be at once degraded and beautiful or virile. And that is a really complicated way to think about the world. I talk about like changing the way that we look at the world, and looking for these derelict sites or these abandoned sites where nature is coming to the fore in an unusual way. And as soon as I started looking for them, I see them absolutely everywhere. I live in a small, quite old town. It's heyday was like 18th, 19th century, and there are a lot of really old, can tumble down old buildings with like trees growing in their roofs, or they're covered in all different species and wild grasses and strange flowers growing just in unexpected places. And I realized that actually I'm surrounded by species that are doing the best of sometimes a bad lot, and that they're really inspiring. These are the heroes that are making it work for them, and they're doing all of this work without any input from us. And that once I realized that it's not just us trying to sort of fix the world and fix the harm that we've done to it, but also that at some level all these other species are also just trying to do the best that they can, and that they've got powers that we can't even predict to start recolonizing things. And if we can help to enable that, like they have a lot of firepower that we don't. And I think that is one of the, I'm not sure if I'm explaining this terribly well, but I've found that a great source of hope when you're interested in the environment, and especially sort of reading about climate. There's not an area that fills you with hope very often. And I think so that was something that was really nice just to tune into, and to understand that this sort of messiness in the environment around us, and sometimes the built environment, is not always a bad thing. That actually these messy places can be incredibly important and to play a role, and to understand that we don't always need to clean everything up all the time, that in fact cleaning up can damage some things. That was a sort of big corrective for my way of thinking. So that's one of them. And I guess one other theme was the way that these places affect us. I spoke about this book starting from a feeling. And so that feeling I really dug down into. My background's in psychology. So I was looking at the way I've come to understand that abandoned places can sort of affect us in like polar ways, which is like they can thrill us and almost like magnetize us. Like there's a reason that people are interested in these like highly aestheticized images of ruin porn, as some people call it. But also like they do frighten us, they scare us, and they are connected to like very real public health issues and mental health issues. So like they fear us and they scare us and oppress us in some ways, and yet they thrill us and free us in others.
It's okay. So something comes up for me here in these last few moments, and I hope that you'll appreciate this because of your background in psychology. So I'm about 3 months away. I'm exactly 3 months away from earning my PhD in clinical psychology,
Oh,
and when
congratulations.
Oh, thank you. It's been a slog. It's still a slog. I'm working on my internship right now. I'm in my internship and I'm finishing my dissertation. And, my sort of area of emphasis has really developed into existential end of life work. And a lot of my influence comes from people like Viktor Frankl and from logotherapy. And I see this fascinating parallel. You talked about these two major themes, and you really discussed the psychological component of the second one. But going back to the first one, I can't help but make this parallel in my mind to logotherapy, which is meaning-centered therapy. It's an approach to working with people who are dealing with like tremendous suffering and really a difficult situation where they have no choice. It's built out of Viktor Frankl, his work that he continued when he was in Auschwitz and was seeing everyone around him die. Right? It was like a place where he had no capability, no choice. Everything was terrible, and his view was, they can't take my perspective away from me. Even amongst this horrific suffering and tragedy, there are, there's light, there's hope, there's strength that I can find because I can make meaning. And I think about this beautiful allegory of these places that were destroyed. And we're not taking that away. We shouldn't be destroying things. And things were destroyed sort of at our hand. Yet, even amongst the background of that detriment, there is a sort of hope and a beauty, and something can thrive from that. I see that so often when I work with cancer patients, and they'll say to me, yeah, but I would have rather learned this lesson without almost dying from cancer or without being on my way to dying from cancer. And
Of
it's like,
course.
yeah, of course you would. And nobody thinks you had to go through this to learn that lesson. But the truth of the matter is that this thing is happening. And so what is the lesson that we can learn from it? And I don't know, I keep going back to that with your writing, this idea that, of course we didn't want Chernobyl to happen. Of course the DMZ is a horrible situation. The fact that we have to have this like stalemate zone between, it's like the deadliest place on the planet for human beings. And because people can't go there or they'll get killed, these organisms are thriving. Obviously, we don't want that to be the case, but it is the case.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's the perfect parallel. Like we don't want to be in this situation. We are. What have we learned from that? And the answer is really a great deal, and a great deal that can bring us hope and optimism for the future. And that at least is something to be thankful for.
Yeah, I mean, people quote Frankel a lot, and they talk about all of the how do you make meaning out of tragedy and blah blah blah. But they always forget this one part of one of his most important quotes, which is, I'm paraphrasing here, but to suffer needlessly is not brave; it's masochistic. Like, obviously, there are times in our life when we must suffer, and if we can make meaning from those times, it can really bring us a lot of purpose and a lot of serenity. But to choose to suffer is not a brave thing to do. It's masochistic. And I think it's the same thing for us. We have made a lot of mistakes as a species on this planet, and we have done a lot of damage to our home. I think we can make meaning from that. And I think that there is hope and we can grow from that. But to continue to do it is not brave. It's masochistic.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Cal, I have some questions for you. They're the big ones. I always close my podcast asking my guests to answer two really big questions. And of course, I won't be surprised if the work that you're doing doesn't influence your answers, but I don't also want to prime you for that because they can be in whatever context is relevant to you.
Okay.
Basically, I'm going to ask you about the future. I'm going to ask you about your hopes and about kind of your pessimisms about the future. And you can answer in whatever context feels relevant. So personal, professional, communal, global, cosmic, whatever. Number one, where are you finding that you struggle? You know, what are you pessimistic about? Maybe you're cynical about. What's keeping you up the most at night when you think about the future? But then on the flip side of that, where do you find your hope and your optimism? Like, how can you maintain a sort of authentic, genuine stance that is one that is hopeful?
You know, like the my great source of sort of dread is this idea of like we've been talking about the environment, so uh, thinking about the idea of when you hit these sort of feedback loops, when the climate might run out of control, and we don't know when that's going to happen. And I think that, you know, like there is a certain extent to which my great optimism, which I think has grown a lot during this project. I'm not a natural optimist, but somehow I've ended up writing this like incredibly hopeful book. I don't know how, but I think that idea of not knowing, you know, how fast things could accelerate is my greatest source of fear. Um, and that's a real existential one, and I don't know that anyone can help me with it. But then on a daily basis, you know, you ride these sort of strange emotional roller coasters when you read one article and it sends you into deep gloom, and then you read another article and you think, oh, maybe this could be okay, you know. And I just don't know, you know, what is a rational people, what is a rational response to this? Like, I don't have one. I just have this incredible emotional roller coaster on a day-to-day basis. And I think like my hope comes from the fact that there are a lot of very smart, very motivated people out there learning very quickly, and that, you know, as a species, we've proved time and time again, because we've had to, that we can turn things around. And at some level, to get on with the day, you have to have like a great sense of trust and hope that we can do this. And so I think when you ask, you know, am I feeling hopeful, am I feeling full of dread, the answer will change depending on what day it is. But I think it's very valuable to understand that there is hope and there could be a way out, and to open yourself to that, and try to reject this sort of like doomism or nihilism. Or certainly if you have my kind of personality, I need a sense of hope to understand that our actions continue to make a difference. And so I think that is one of my motivations when I go out looking for these stories, these like silver linings, is to help me understand that we need to keep going.
Yeah, I love that. It's like, you know, maybe we've set the house on fire, but I do think that we're really trying hard to put it out and to figure out how to make it a little bit less flammable for the future. So yeah, it's a tough one, right? Because you're right, it vacillates so much, and it really depends sometimes on sort of the tone of what's in the news and the side of the bed that we woke up on. But ultimately, um, we have to maintain hope. You know, I go back to the patients that I work with who have cancer, and people ask them all the time, like, how do you do it? I don't know how you do it. And they're like, I just do. I have to. What's the
Yeah,
alternative,
there is
right? Like,
nothing else. Yeah,
yeah. And people always say, well, you could just roll over and die. And like, spoiler alert, have you ever tried to do that? When you roll over, you don't just die. You
yeah,
know, like
yeah.
eventually you got to get up and pee. You got to feed yourself something. You will continue. So you fight, and you have to. And it's just, I think we as a species are in a situation where we have to do that because this is our home.
Mm, You get up and you go on the next day, and you, yeah, we have to, because this is where we live.
Yeah. And we want a future for ourselves. So yeah, gosh, it's such a lovely piece of literature. I mean, I know it's nonfiction, but it's so literary, and I just really appreciate you painting some of these pictures for us here on the show. But of course, a podcast is nothing like a book, and so I really do encourage everyone to dig deep into it, to read Islands of Abandonment, Nature Rebounding in the Post-Human Landscape. That's the American title. It has a different title in the UK, right? That's Life in the Post-Human Landscape.
Yeah. It's interesting to see like the how the same text translates into different countries. It's going through the process of being translated into different languages at the moment, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
people really like change the title. And it's really interesting. People say you have to have this great sense of faith because obviously I don't speak Japanese or Korean or
Right.
whatever it is. So you just say, okay, that looks like a different title, and they say, yeah, it works really well in Japanese, and you have to say, okay, good, you know what you're doing.
Yeah. I can imagine that's the case with the full translation too. It's at least between the UK and the US translations. It's like we just make you remove all the U's and replace all your Z's, and we're like, sorry, it's Z's, and then we're like, okay, good enough.
Yeah, exactly. There's like a tiny number of terminology things, and that's it. So it's really nice to speak to so many Americans and just to see the book sort of do that jump across the oceans and go well at a book. So I'm really pleased about it.
Oh, love it. Well, gosh, thank you so much for spending so much time with us today and for painting this beautiful picture in our heads. It's been a lovely conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.